Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about suspension systems and different types of suspension systems. But first of all, we want to start off with the PPE, or personal protective equipment. We want to start off with the safety glasses. Those just protect your eyes from dirt and debris, and they just save your eyes from falling objects. Also, hearing protection. With earplugs, it just saves your ears and your eardrums from all the loud noises, such as like when you're using an air gun or like air hammer, stuff like that. It just saves your hearing. These thinner latex gloves, they work really well for small and tedious jobs when you're assembling tedious parts, and they just save your skin from acids and substances that could sink into your skin and have serious side effects like cancer. These thicker leather gloves I like to use for heavier jobs, working with colder objects or welding. They keep the sparks off your hands, and the sparks won't typically burn through the leather. These jackets are really nice to have. They save your clothes from when you're working on the ground under a vehicle or whatnot. They also save your skin and your clothes from welding, and they keep you clean. It's a good layer to wear. It protects you. And now onto footwear. Steel toe boots like this, they're the proper workplace equipment for your feet. They keep your toes safe. If you drop anything on your toes, it won't really hurt. These are pretty solid. These are not the right things to wear. Just shoes like this. You drop anything on your toes, you're gonna crush your toes. All right. So today, the tools that we're gonna need to remove the tire from the vehicle and inspect the suspension are, if we're working in a shop, it's best to have an air gun, the proper size socket, a breaker bar, and a torque wrench. We're going to use the breaker bar to break the lug nuts loose, and then we can use the air gun to spin the nuts off the rest of the way. And when we're putting the tire back on, we're going to use the torque bar to set the lug nuts to the correct torque so that the wheel stays in the vehicle. But when we jack it up, we are going to want to use a proper floor jack like the one under the truck over there. And we are going to want to have, you're going to need jack stands. The jack stands are a very secure way of keeping your vehicle lifted off the ground, because the car jacks, they're hydraulic and they can lower over time. But if you were stuck on the side of a road with a blown tire, you're going to only have the car jack that comes with the vehicle and the bars to raise it. You may not have a floor jack to keep the vehicle up, so it's best to stay clear of under the vehicle when changing a tire. And you're only going to have this tire iron. So, before we take off the tire, I have read through the owner's manual, and just from my experience, the best way to jack up this Ford F-150 to take off the rear wheel is to find the axle and go about midway to the differential and just raise the tire high enough with this car jack a few inches off the ground, not so high that if it falls it can hurt anyone. And then to secure the truck in the air, I use the jack stand, and I set that to the proper height that the car jack has lifted the vehicle to. So now that I have the vehicle securely jacked up and in place, and on the jack stands, I have chalked the tire with a piece of wood so that the wheel won't rotate as I am breaking the lug nuts loose. This truck uses a 13/16" size socket, and I'm going to be using the tire iron because this is the tool you'll be using on the side of the road. So I'm going to go ahead and break a few of these lug nuts loose. So now that I have broken all the lug nuts loose with the tire iron, I'm going to go ahead and use the air gun that I've connected to the air compressor to take the lug nuts off the rest of the way. Now that I've safely removed the lug nuts and I've placed them in a secure location so that I will not lose them, when I put the tire back on. And I was using proper safety equipment while using the air gun just to prevent any possible injury. So now I'm going to carefully take off the wheel and roll it out of the way into a safe place, and then I will continue to inspect. So now that we have safely taken the rear tire off the vehicle, we can start to examine the components of the rear leaf spring suspension system. So starting at this end, we have the leaf spring shackle, and this part is used for when the leaf spring soaks up the bump. The shackle rotates minimally so that it's not just transferring the weight straight into the frame. And the leaf spring is made up of a few different layers of metal, and you can buy different types of leaf springs for different size loads and what you want to do with your suspension. And the leaf springs mount to the vehicle's frames so that they are secured to the vehicle. This here is the bump stop. That is used for when the vehicle goes over a very big bump and the axle doesn't get pushed all the way up through the frame. This bump stop has a little bit of cushion to soften the blow. This here is a shock absorber. It assists the leaf springs with absorbing the impact, and it's hydraulic, and it compresses very slow, and it's hard to compress. It also assists in returning the axle back down to the proper height, and assists with keeping the truck at the correct height. These massive U-bolts here are what are used to mount the leaf springs to the rear axle, and they are about half an inch thick, and they are used to hold on to the rear axle with these brackets. This bracket runs across the bottom of the axle and is a solid piece to the other side here, which comes up and around through here. This keeps the rear axle intact with the vehicle's body and frame, and all the energy that is transferred through the tire into the axle, and if there was no suspension, the frame would take the big hit, and so would our bodies riding inside the cab. But with the leaf springs, they absorb the shock as well as the shock absorber, and it really cushions the ride. And if the bump is too big, or if you carry more speed than you should have over a bump, this bump stop assists in not letting a massive bang happen. So another thing you can do with the rear suspension assembly is, if you wanted to put bigger tires or lift your truck and put a lift kit on it just for looks. Lift kits typically don't have any pros to them. It's just an accessory for aesthetic. If you were to install a lift kit, you would have to take off these U-bolts, and you would need to purchase longer ones. And right here, this is where the axle is, and here is the block, and here's the leaf spring. You would remove this block or add another block on top of it. Most of the time, you would just replace the whole block with a bigger block, and you can buy a variety of different sizes, and they usually are measured in inches. Another thing to do that really improves the ride when carrying a load is installing airbags on your suspension. That means removing the bump stop here and installing an airbag system onto your vehicle, and that takes the load when you're carrying a trailer or a camper on the box of your truck. It the airbags soak up the weight of the load so that the leaf springs can still do their job, whereas the leaf springs are supporting the load of the trailer or the load in the box of your truck and having to absorb bumps. It really improves the lifespan of your leaf springs, and that's how the airbags work, and that's how to install a lift kit if you so desire on your vehicle. Another thing to note is that the rear the rear suspension will always be stiffer than the front suspension, so that the front doesn't bounce as much as or as like violently as the rear suspension. And the rear suspension can soak up the bumps, and because if the front of the vehicle starts really bobbing after hitting a bump because of the softer suspension, it's really hard on the driver and it's super hard to steer. The suspension setup will always be different on the front of the vehicle, as you'll see when we get into that in a few seconds here. So now that we have identified some of the parts and components of the rear leaf spring suspension system, we are going to mount the tire back on the vehicle, and we are going to start by moving the tire as close as possible to the axle and the studs. Then I find it's easiest to put the tire on my toes and lift the toes a little bit. And you want to line the holes up with all the studs. Sometimes it takes a little bit of playing around, just like that. And just have a foot on the bottom, right down here, to prevent the tire from sliding off. And we'll grab our tray of lug nuts that we had pushed to the side earlier. And we are just going to start by screwing the lug nuts on a few turns to start with, so that when we hit it with the impact gun, we are not going to strip any of the threads. And when we put these lug nuts on, we are going to do them in a crisscross or star pattern so that it equalizes the pressure on the rim equally. So now that I have lined up the tire, put it on the studs, and started each of the lug nuts by finger, I am going to use the air gun to snug them up in a star pattern or crisscross pattern, starting from the top going to the bottom, and then across, 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 and back again. After going and reading the owner's manual, I have found that the torque specs for this Ford F-150 are 150 foot-pounds of torque on each of the bolts. So now that I've tightened them or snugged them all up with the air gun, I am going to hit them all with the torque wrench in the star pattern once again, and tighten them to the right torque adjustment. And I'm also going to shock the tires so that when I am tightening it, the wheel does not rotate. Now that I've chalked the wheel, I'm going to go ahead and there, that's one. We have to check that the wrench is still set at the proper weight. And we are still doing the crisscross pattern. There, and then I'm going to continue to do that on the rest of the lug nuts. But I've just gone through and tightened all the lug nuts to spec with the torque wrench, and then I went around in a circular pattern to double check that they're all tight. And the reasoning for doing it in the star-cross pattern is to eliminate any wobble after assembling the tire. So like instead of tightening the tire level, it would be on a camber, which could create real problems, strip threads, and the wheel could even fall off. So after I had finished putting the rear wheel back on, I raised the jack a little bit and I lowered the jack stands, and then I came over here and I read the owner's manual to figure out the factory jacking points, and I raised the truck and I secured it on 2 jack stands just to be safe, and then I used the same procedure to take off the front wheel by breaking all the lug nuts loose and then using an air gun to take it off. And now we have the hub assembly here, we have the spindle, the coil over shock here, we have the upper ball joints, and the lower ball joints here. And here we also have the anti-sway bar that acts as a torsion bar. So on the coilover assembly here, while the coil spring mainly supports the weight of the vehicle, they both work together to soak up the bump and rebound together smoothly. And the upper and lower ball joints they connect to the spindle to allow the suspension to move freely and be able to steer the vehicle at the same time. The upper ball joint connects to the upper control arm, and the lower ball joint connects to the lower control arm here. The upper and lower control arms both attach to the frame of the vehicle. So now that I've properly have the wheel put on the vehicle and torqued to spec, I'm going to remove the jack stands. So what I'm going to have to do is raise the truck a little bit with the car jack, just enough to get pressure off the jack stands to release them. And I'm going to slowly lower the vehicle.